Hey, paisans, the time has come. On the air since 2009, the independently produced, non-FCC compliant champ of video game talk podcasting. Here comes Tiger Claw Radio. Here's your host, Critical Failure.
Welcome, everybody, to Tiger Claw Radio. I'm your host, Critical Failure. This week, we got a chiptunes return to form from chipmusic.org, which we've got up for the last couple weeks. An actual, I gave the new Saints Row game a shot, finally. Also, we're going to talk about, I had a thing I was recording about the Epic Game Store, and I just went off on a tangent about the old CD-ROM days, which made me feel real good. So we got a bunch of that and more coming up, but let's start with chipmusic.org, which is a great site that I've been enjoying going back to. A couple of familiar names. 8-Bit Nintendo's apparently tearing that website up. They got another one from him, but we're going to kick things off with Amateur LSDJ with For Old Time's Sake. You're listening to Tiger Claw Radio. More when we come back. So I bought the newer, I say newer, it's been a year or so now, but I bought the Saints Row game, the latest one, the reboot that got everybody so upset that Volition ended up actually closing its doors as a company after that. And it's about what you'd expect it to be. I mean, pushing aside anything political you might think about all the ridiculous statements they were trying to make, just purely as a game, oh man, I'm kind of shocked at how muted it is visually. The Saints Row games have always been super colorful and really comic booky in that way, and I think this one, they got confused on where that comes from, and they just thought, a wacky character design would take care of it. But just regular gameplay, driving around town, it just, I don't know, man. It does really seem like it's missing something. Now, to be fair, there's some of the elements I liked about Saints Row are still there. There's still cars you can steal. You still have, an apartment you can go back to and drop the cars off and build up a garage full of cars, and it's a lot of fun in that respect. I have put 90 minutes into the game. Let's see what my actual time is at. Hold on a second. Let me look this up. Saints Row. 93 minutes, and I don't know who all the gangs are. So I feel like there's a storytelling issue involved with the game. Like I realized in Saints Row 3, you had to do that like bank robbery mission first, and in Saints Row 2, you had to escape the prison first. You had to do things before they introduced all the gangs. But this one seems to follow that same structure of you've got the Saints, and then you've got these other gangs that you have to, eventually take over. But it hasn't really, like, who? What? There's the boss and 3 other characters, and I couldn't name them, So, I'm still, what I will say is I'm still going to return to it, because it's still, Rudy Tooty point and shooty. When the bullets start flying, it's Saints Row again, but the story they're trying to tell is not coming across. On top of that, I've had some weird physics issues that don't seem to match up. Like they tried to give the cars like a couple extra tricks. Like now you can do like a side swipe move where you right click and then press A and D, and the car will jut left or right. Which I guess is a neat addition. Gives you some defense in terms of driving. But I've come across the weirdest thing I've come across is they added a drift mechanic. Okay, so you can like hold the space bar and turn. You throw on the handbrake. You're driving sideways a little bit. When you're moving very fast in Saints Row in a car, in several other games as well, and you come to a complete stop all of a sudden, your character can shoot through the windshield, right? I seem to remember this being like a point of achievement in the third game, where it was like a car torpedo or something like that. Anyway, in Saints Row, the new one, I was drifting, I was driving sideways, and then I hit something because I was going at a very fast speed, and my character shot out of the windshield. Remember, the car was being propelled sideways, and the character shot out straight out the windshield, perpendicular from where I was actually, like the direction I was actually traveling in. And I'm not just talking about this being a one-off weird experience. This happens a lot. Very buggy game. Very buggy. And I'm aware that like these open world games are like they're prone to bugs like this, but this isn't just an open world game. This is a Saints Row game, and a bunch of games have come before it, and none of those other games have experienced these types of bugs. So there's that. So I don't know. As far as look, I spent $13 on it, and if I play it all the way through, then I guess I got my $13 worth. So I'm not going to be returning it, right? I've only played it for 90 minutes, and 2 hours is the cutoff for return. So I'll play it through, just because whatever multiplayer features that it has are going to go down very quickly. The game's already a year old, and I can't imagine it'd stay up forever. Saints Row 3 had like some sort of achievement based on, was it 3 or 4? One of them had an achievement based on posting your character in like their character drop thing that went down after only 5 years. So that's one of the reasons I decided to throw down and give it a shot, because it's still early enough. I should be able to take advantage of whatever multiplayer facets it may or may not have. But when it comes down to it, playing the new Saints Row game just made me want to play Saints Row 3 again, because that's far and away the best one. Now, I know that they remade Saints Row 3, and I did pick that up too, but I don't know. Maybe I should just install that. So they gave away the Saints Row remake in on Epic a little while back, and I was laughing about it. because they were so I don't know. They were so mean to their fan base. Fans were like, I don't know about these changes, man. This new game looks like it's really not what we want. And they were like, yeah, well, who cares? So it is kind of funny to see how far how far they haven't come since then. But anyway, that's the Saints Row game. Combat, the shooting is solid. One change that I'll say that I did like was in Saints Row 3, you had a takedown button, Shift and E, and you could just take somebody down, and that was very overpowered. But it was also a lot of fun. It does exist in the new Saints Row game, but now they gave it a meter, so you can only do it every once in a while, and I think that brings a little bit more balance. Like, I thought that was a positive addition. Some of the mechanics, like that, along with the driving, the additional driving tricks, the drifting, the side swiping, when they work, are actually very positive, mechanical changes, which is why it's such a shame that Volition shuttered after this game. Because if they took these same mechanics, polished them up a little bit, and then made a second game, like in more of a return to form, it could have been a really great game. But then again, when it comes to video games, how many times in history can we look at things and say, wow, there could have been a really great game here? A lot. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, as they say, and this is what we're left with. And that's my opinion of Saints Row as it stands now, 90 minutes into the game. It's story time, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about video games from when I was a kid, so we can bring up some of those memories that you can't read about on Wikipedia. So last week we talked about IBM compatibles, old luggable computers with 5 1/4 inch floppy disks, playing Marble Madness in my basement. Well, amongst the floppies that we had Pinball Construction Set by Bill Budge, and we had Stuart Smith's Adventure Construction Set. And in those days, I was obsessed with any game that had a level editor, because the vast majority of games didn't. We encountered it on the NES a handful of times. Excitebike, right? I was way more into Excitebike than I would have been if there was no track editor. I remember, I think his Lode Runner had one too. Not many, but a few games did. So Pinball Construction Set was a game that looked amazing, but here's the deal. Games that are that old, a handful of them just ran as fast as a computer could do it. There was no regulation on the speed of the game. It just ran as fast as the CPU cycles could handle. So by that time, it was already considered an old game. It wasn't an ancient classic like it is now, but we're talking about a game that came out in the late 80s, being played in like 1993 or 94 or something like that. So to play Pinball Construction Set, you could create the table just fine, but the second you actually ran it to play it, everything just went like the ball went at lightning speed, and a second later it said game over. There were ways to deal with it, but I didn't know about them at that time. So eventually what I found out was there were speed and gravity settings within Pinball Construction Set that you could set to the lowest speed and the lowest gravity, and if you did that, the computer that I ran was just slow enough that it would run Pinball Construction Set in such a way that you could actually play the games. And when I figured that out, I was so excited, and I ran and told my brothers, hey, Pinball Construction Set, I got it to work finally, after all these years. And they were like, who cares? And I was like, oh, okay. So I got right to work, and I managed to get a hold of, I don't remember how I got it, but I got a box, an unopened box of 5 1/4 inch floppy disks. And I'm pretty sure it was like something like, it was tech trash that belonged to my dad, because my dad had a lot of 5 1/4 inch floppies, but they were already like phased out. I remember at the end of his life, he was buying a computer. He passed in 97, so this would have been like late 96 or so. And he had to go far out of his way to make sure that the builders, because he bought it from a company, included a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk. And I remember him explaining that people just don't use those anymore, but he wanted to have access to his old software. All right, so already old thing. And I filled this box of floppies up with pinball tables. I had so much fun. I vividly remember how some of them worked. But the thing about Pinball Construction Set was there was 2 ways you could save your game. You could save it in a PB table, which just saved the raw data that you could reload into Pinball Construction Set, or you could actually export an executable file. It wasn't a .exe, it was a .com, which pre-internet stood for command, a command file. You could take the command file and you could put it on a floppy disk, and it would run independent of the actual creation software. You might also remember in the early days of the CD-ROM, there used to be like these, hey, shareware, 1,000 games of share, and you'd buy the CD, and it'd have like the shareware version of Duke Nukem and the shareware version of all this, that, and the other. A lot of times when we encountered those, they'd have Pinball Construction Set tables, not the software itself, but just the tables as executables packaged in, which I thought was funny. But I had this huge box of pinball tables, and I played them. And my buddy Albert also had a Windows 3.1 computer that we were able to put them on. And then one day, the discs just stopped reading. And I think this was my first encounter in life with storage data being corrupted. Because usually storage data wouldn't get corrupted for me. Something would happen and the unit would get destroyed or lost. But all of these discs, every single one of them, just ceased to function. And the box still remains in my house, in my mom's house. When I go to visit her, I take a look. You can see written in Sharpie in my childlike handwriting, Pinball 1, Pinball 2, Pinball 3. And so much time was spent on this. I have since gone back and reacquired Pinball Construction Set, from abandonware sites, because it's not something you can buy anymore. You can load that game up in any given version of DOSBox, and you can play it, and you can save your pinball table into the local .pb format, but for whatever reason, it will not allow you to save that .com, that .command file, so that you could run the pinball tables independently. I didn't look too deep into why. I think it might be a DOSBox thing. So like if I were able to make a virtual DOS machine and run Pinball Construction Set that way, perhaps it could be done. But I found it too difficult to transfer files back and forth between virtual machines, so I just let it go. But Pinball Construction Set is the greatest, most lasting game, I think, in terms of stuff worth going back to of that era. There was never another game quite like it. Bill Budge even worked on a Sega Genesis game called Virtual Pinball. I used to tell this story on Tiger Claw TV, and people would bring up Virtual Pinball for the Sega Genesis, and lo and behold, that's also Bill Budge. Not quite as good, because the playfield is not shaped like a pinball table. Pinball tables are elongated, right? But still pretty cool. If you wanted to create your own pinball table and enjoy it, we never really had a whole lot of options. There were a couple of like fringe programs. Later, we had a game called Pinball Builder in like 1995 or so. I managed to track down a CD, and I never got it working, not even with a virtual machine. There's a game called, I think it's Visual Pinball, which is like a pinball builder kit, but it's more of like a dev tool. So like points wouldn't acquire unless you actually wrote in some of the VB code to make it work. And in my youth, I just couldn't do it. So there was never a game that ever took its place the same way. So if you have ever booted up DOSBox, I implore you, just once, load up Pinball Construction Set, because that game has never been duplicated, not in 40 years. We are right about that time. We're just before the 20-minute mark. I want to take a minute to thank the sponsors. This is a Patreon-sponsored program, EmeraldRangers.com, which, by the way, we resolved the issue with hosting space that we had last week. Not a problem. Sendu actually upgraded the service, which is an amazing move. I'm really glad he did that, because I whatever it takes to keep Durabka and the Gaming Beast, the Beastcast, back on the air, is awesome. So that's very, very cool. So EmeraldRangers.com. We've also got Tecmo Balls, and we've got Durabka. Thank you guys so much. I hope you're enjoying the party. So let's return to the well over at chipmusic.org. And I know this is the second, third week running playing 8-Bit Chintendo, but again, it's not like I'm going to look up this guy's music. He's showing up constantly on the new music listing on chipmusic.org. And this one's called Seaside, and again, roots chiptunes. I don't know how else to explain it. I know I've been questioned before on using that phrase, but old school chiptune sound. Konami expansion chip sound. You're listening to Tiger Claw Radio. Check it out. I was poking around at some things on my computer. Again, computer's only like, a month old now, something like that. So one of the things that I stopped doing on my old computer was using alternate storefronts for digital downloads. By that I mean, I've always been a Steam head, but eventually Shut up! Eventually I stopped using GOG Galaxy, and I stopped using Epic and all that stuff, and Origin, because I noticed that they were having an effect on, they stay open all the time. They have these little micro processes that stay open even when you're not using them. And my computer just couldn't handle having them, much less actually opening them to run a game. So I stayed away from them for a long time, but now that I have the newer computer and it seems to function very well, I got those reinstalled. I reinstalled GOG Galaxy, and I reinstalled, brace yourselves, the Epic Games Launcher. And let's launch the Epic Games Launcher once again. My old buddy Alex Swingle, I talk to occasionally, enjoys in massive air quotes, but he plays the Fortnite or did. So I was like, hey, you know, I've never played Fortnite by myself, but there have been occasions in the past where other people were like, yo, you want to play this? And I said, yes, we could do that again. You know, Swingle's a guy I'm always saying, hey, here's game I'm interested in. Let's play game I'm interested in. And I'm trying to convince him to play, you know. So I was trying to reach into the barrel, like, what are you playing, bro? He was like, don't play Fortnite. The long and short of it. But the conversation then came to, look, we've been getting these games from the Epic Game Store forever. They give away their free game every week or month or whatever it is. I even have a bot. If you're not involved in my Discord, look, I know it's another Discord. I have one bot that makes it worth maintaining, and that is the Epic Games bot. Every time they change the free game on the Epic Game Store, there's a devoted channel. It'll display the new game. It'll, you know, show the poster for the game, and then have a link to where you can go to the website and associate it to your account. You never even have to install the Epic Games launcher. So I haven't had the launcher installed in forever, but I've been maintaining my account. So where we went with this was, hey, go back through your account, and there's got to be something worth playing in there. My knee-jerk reaction was Fez. Do you guys remember Fez from several years ago? The game that was made by Phil Fish, whatever he named his company, that they talked about in Indie Games the movie. People said that was really good, and I never wanted to purchase it for any amount of money because I was not a fan of Philip Fish. But I did pick it up for free on the Epic Game Store. It was one of the early games they gave away years ago, and I have it installed. I think that might be the only single-player game I had ever played until this last week. But that's one worth installing. I'm flipping through my collection now to see if there's anything else, because I know I've seen, like, oh, hey, that might be worth it. I've got Death Stranding, which I never wanted, like, I wasn't interested enough to buy, but I have it on Epic Games Store. I guess I could play it there. Fallout Tactics 1, 2, 3, New Vegas. I would never play these on Epic. I have Galactic Civilizations 3. I like the Galactic Civilizations games. I have 1 and 2 on Steam. I had a hard copy CD of 2 for a while. But yeah, that might be one I would try. A lot of this looks like games that just don't resonate with me, but but are not necessarily bad. Gloomhaven, Ghostwire, Ghostrunner. Come on, there's got to be at least one other game in here. Kerbal Space Program. That was supposed to be a good one, right? That's in my collection. A lot of slop. Neo. I don't know how to pronounce this. Neo, Nioh, the complete edition. That's supposed to be pretty good. I would install that and play it. You know, if I played video games. Sorry. Yes, there's the original Saints Row that they gave away for free. Here we go. RPG in a box. Every single one of these game development tools I want to try. I want to try every single one of them. And once I've tried them, I'm just going to go back to RPG Maker because that's what I like. Shenmue 3, I don't think I would buy that on well, I don't know if I'd buy it or not, but I've got that on Epic Games, so I might try that. Sonic Mania, that's one I would actually buy, but I don't have it on Steam, so that's one worth playing. What else? Is that it? The Evil Within, I don't know what that is, but the poster looks cool as hell. The latest version of Trackmania, which I think is now also on Steam. Yeah, and there you go. That's a handful. Oh, what is this? Wonder Boy, the Dragon Trap? The Dragon's Trap. Yeah, Wonder Boy game. Okay, so it took a couple of years, but I've managed to get a couple of games that I might play a little bit in my Epic Games account. I'm not at this point where how do I say this? I'm not popping open my Epic account for things to do. It's just not what I'm doing, which is what I know they want, but the store is just so, oh my gosh. They need more, they need to get more UI people, because I have a hard time looking through this store and finding things that interest me. And it's not just because the games that they have are not games that I want, because they got a lot of games. I'm sure I could find something in here, but I don't know. That coupled with you're going against Steam's like Steam sale culture, and even though the Steam sales are not nearly what they used to be, they're still, rarely matched on the internet. Rarely matched, with the exception of maybe the GOG sales. The GOG holiday sales the last couple of years, I think, have surpassed Steam in their awesomeness. And this Epic Games Store, I just don't think they can compare. But let me say this, something positive about Epic. I have this installed right now, which I would never do up until recently. For me, that is a huge step. And I might one day actually play a game from it, but not today. I think if I were to go non-Steam today, GOG Galaxy is where it's at. I reinstalled GOG Galaxy, and I had forgotten how awesome GOG is. I was not a big fan of GOG Galaxy 2.0. It was their client that was their big push was to unify the different platforms. Right? You can associate Steam, you can associate Epic. All your games will show up on one platform. It was a disaster. I did not like it. So consequently, we're left with, they've updated it since then. Like, they've cleaned it up quite a bit. But my big problem, and I know I can probably fix this if I was smarter or knew more or whatever. I go to owned games. Right now it says 2,408. That's not correct. I have to go up to filter by platform, only show me my GOG.com games, please. And then it cuts it down significantly. And then when it comes to GOG, we can't play the same game of, what's worth playing on here? Because GOG has a great deal, I don't want to say a great deal, but GOG has a few games that you can't get anywhere else that are really, truly worth owning. Even without buying any new games, just staying within my account, right? The original Metal Gear Solid, I love that game. That was the first game I went to when I reinstalled this. I was thinking about playing that one again. Pod Gold, which is a game that doesn't translate very well, but very early 3D, not early 3D, but the Voodoo card. It was like the early Voodoo card PC game. I like it. I have a special place in my heart for Pod Gold because I remember playing the demo off of it. The demo of that game off of something called PC Gamer Magazine, which you older guys will all recognize. PC Gamer Magazine, a physical magazine, mind you, which seems foreign to younger gamers, but it came along with a CD, and the CD had demos and stuff in it. But at one point, instead of just having demos and little programs or whatever, that you would put it in, and it had this whole animated sequence with something they called the coconut monkey, which I'm sure is very racially insensitive, that you wouldn't see today. But it would say, hey, here's the island. Explore the little island of island slideshow, and play the demos and whatever. And that was the environment that I first experienced this game Pod Gold in. It was the internet was already around then, but it was. Hang on a second, you wise guys here. Okay, we're good. The internet was already around then, but dial-up was what everyone had. Those were the days of AOL. So it was unrealistic to say, all right, there's 10 new games on the market right now. They've all got demos or whatever. I'm just going to download each one of these games and I'll try them out and see what I like. No, that was unrealistic because to download a game in those days, you could do it. But number one, it took all night or more. And if anybody picked up the phone, it would knock you offline and you would lose your progress. So there's that. And then also there was hard drive space. We're kind of spoiled now with the hard drive space we have. My PC came with a 2 terabyte hard drive. which I'll probably have to be upgrading at some point. But in those days, half a gig, something like that, half a gig, and you were in good shape. I remember my dad's PC that he bought in 1996 had a 2 gigabyte hard drive. And I remember being in a phone call with my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, who was much older and it was an IT professional, programming or whatever it was he did. And I remember him saying, man, 2 gigs is mammoth. And I remember he used that word, mammoth. And for some reason, that was one of those things, like, I don't know if you've experienced this, but it was one of those little conversations that just stuck with me. And every time I see, like, anything related to hard drive space, all right, so the new computer is going to have 2 terabytes of hard drive space. And there's also space on the motherboard, so I can attach new ones. I've got a couple of 1 terabyte hard drives I could put in it, expanding it even further. But you know what? 2 gigabytes is mammoth. So big thanks to my brother-in-law for giving me that gem. That's the one that's been with me for a lot of years. 2 gigabytes is indeed mammoth. It was mammoth on a Windows 95 computer. And the point I was making was there was a limit in those days how many things you could have installed. And another thing is when you installed a game, particularly off of a CD-ROM, the installation process was not like a quick thing, right? Now you get on Steam or whatever, and you download you hit the button, and all of the time is in the download. Once the thing is downloaded, maybe there's a brief install, or maybe not, but not in those days, man. You would sit and wait while it copied the files off the CD, and you would sit and wait while it ran that install. And it took time. It took time that we don't have to spend on things now, which is why when you look back at the way the gaming market was back then, you look things like CDs coming along with PC Gamer, those circumvented having to leave the computer on all night. And it gave us a chance to try games that we probably wouldn't have otherwise. Games that were not great, but just okay. Like Pod Gold, the racing game that flexed the Voodoo card, which we had. We were lucky enough to have a Voodoo card. Not on the one my dad built, but when did we get that one? Not the one my dad built, because my dad built a computer in 96. He passed in 97. And then my brother built a computer like a year later or 2 years later. And that one that my brother built, that had a Voodoo card, and they were still like fresh and new at the time. So I think we played Pod on my dad's old computer that didn't have a Voodoo card, so it didn't run well. And then when it popped up on GOG, I was able to like really experience it sort of the way it was supposed to be. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling, but for a moment there in my head, I went back to those days, and that kind of got me a little excited. But there you go. So that's something, those types of things you can still find on GOG.com and nowhere else. Handful of games like that. And I know that list is shrinking, but for whatever reason, there's certain games that just are holding on, and nowhere else will sell them. Ultima is a great example. You can buy it on GOG, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if you still can, but for a while you could buy it on Origin. Do you guys remember Origin? Which is gone now. Now it's just the EA client. But when EA was trying to do its own Steam thing, they picked up a couple of those, because EA owns everything, or at least they did at one point. But now with them gone, I think that's still the only place you can buy Ultima. So yeah. If you can handle it, GOG is still worth maintaining. But I'll tell you another thing. I have, myself, a nice, fat external hard drive, mostly for movies. But one of the things that I maintain on my external hard drive is a backup copy of every single GOG game I own. None that I don't own, right? I have a decent job now. I don't quite need to do that anymore. But if I own it in my GOG, if I bought it in my GOG account, or if I got it in one of those GOG giveaways, you can guarantee they're never going to take it away from me. So there you go. Rant over. All right. Real quick before we move on to the fail bag, I like to try that one again. I like to cover what's going on IndieRetroNews.com. It's a blog that I follow. A lot of releases for Commodore 64, Amiga, that sort of thing. Their latest, their number one story right now is Gray, a first-person shooter preview for the C64. Definitely worth a look. And it is. There's this game called Gray, and it looks like Blake Stone, or maybe like Blake Stone, but rudimentary even for Blake Stone. More like Catacombs 3D. Maybe the graphics of Catacombs 3D, but the window dressing of Blake Stone. It's a good-looking game. It is unfortunate that it doesn't seem like there's something I can try, but I love these like 2.5D games where they put 3D graphics in systems that just don't do 3D graphics. I love it, and from a programming perspective, I wish I knew how they did it, because I've seen it done. I've seen it done in Pico 8, which is weird. I've seen it done on the Thumby, which is really weird. I'll have to have a conversation with GPT to see how it works. At any rate, I'm going to put the link to this article on the Discord for the week, so you can check it out and see the beauty that is Gray, the FPS in development for the Commodore 64. Good-looking game, man. This is one of those things that reminds me that these machines are alive and well. Not just getting games developed for them, but they're still getting the envelopes pushed after all these years. A couple of games behind that. Mushroom Soup, lovely, albeit short ZX Spectrum game by Ottersoft. Phantomous Tales 4, Serve and Sewers, a high-quality remaster of the 2012 ZX Spectrum game by the Emojin Twins. And then we have Donkey Kong to the Amiga is getting a conversion. So just the last couple of stories that are on that website. Great website. Great website. All right. That said, let's move on to see what people are saying about old TCR. All right. So last week I had those technical issues with EmeraldRangers.com. So last week's episode didn't appear there. But heading over to YouTube, we have comments for the episode from 2 weeks ago. Mega Menace says, I understand that you could not comprehend my question about the Pico 8 ROM sizes due to my bad Butterfinger spelling/grammar. I'll rephrase it here. You mentioned being disappointed by the program/ROM size that Pico 8 could handle. As I understood it, this made you frustrated when considering a pint-sized RPG. In my previous comment, I suggested using generative techniques, such as those used in Mystery Dungeon games, sim games, or Mystery Dungeon games to generate maps, dungeons, or other gameplay content. Furthermore, I suggested looking into compression when you decompress some of the ROM based on the player's progress. Think of it as streaming audio from a CD versus loading the whole track into memory. I don't know what Pico 8's architecture is like, but maybe some of these suggestions would be helpful. All right, so let's explain the reasons why. Well, what he's talking about is like one of the game, like everybody who plays games has their dream game, right? Well, mine would be my own CRPG, right? A CRPG that would be updated, in time consistently. Yeah, there are a handful of guys who have like roguelikes. You have Caves of Cud, and you've got you've got Adam and games like that just get updated year after year after year and kind of stay alive that way. Well, I wanted a CRPG like that I could just keep chipping away at. And in Pico 8, I've been messing with programming, but the problem with Pico 8 is the token limit and the character limit. So you're thinking in terms of like, okay, well, if I make the world this big, then it won't be able to fit. It's not really the case. The real problem is, all right, the coding I would have to put into a functioning inventory system would take up X amount of coding. The coding I would have to put into a functioning combat system would take X amount of tokens, and so on. And the coding that I would have to put in to interpret a map, never mind the size of the map, would take X amount of tokens. And that's the problem. I've actually developed small games that handle all of these little aspects. Little program that just does inventory, just to see how it works. You run out of space quick, and it's kind of on purpose because Pico 8 wants to be used for little sketch games, little prototype things. They don't want to be used for your masterpiece. You got to move to like Love 2D for something like that, which is another Lua-based architecture that works very similar to Pico 8, just exists on its own outside of Pico 8 and used for Windows programs. That would really be the way to go. The trick is when you do that, you lose portability of your program big time. You make the jump to love 2D, you got something that works the same as Pico 8, so you can develop a game as big as you want, right? Okay, that's true if you're making a Windows program. But with Pico 8, I'm able to not only make a Windows program, but I can also export a Linux build. I can put it on their forum thing that makes a playable browser version. And then on top of that, I can import the cart into all my little emulation handhelds, which will all play it too. Highly, highly portable to an extent that I don't think anything else can really touch right now. And that's what keeps me sticking with Pico 8, at least for now. I think when my life settles down a little bit and I have more time to like pop open a laptop and work on it, then maybe that'll change. But it's just not. It's just not in the cards right now. The best thing I can do right now is just study my coding and make sure I understand how these things work, so that once I get the time, I can actually spring into action and make it happen. So I hope that answers your question. The compression and that sort of thing are not really a factor. I think that's stuff that you look into once you've got a functioning engine up and running. And I'm just talking about room for the engine. So I don't know. He also writes in 30 minutes and 44 seconds. This is from episode 472. That Happy New Year song sounds more like a jazzy rendition of Zelda's Link's Awakening song, or maybe some Mario song. It's a very familiar riff. Yeah, I would say it's very familiar, but I can't place it either. So, what are you going to do? Big thanks to Mecha Menace for writing in. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Tiger Claw Radio, episode 474. Thanks very much for listening to some chiptunes and hanging out with us, talking some video games, doing what we do. I really appreciate it. They say time is the greatest currency, the most valuable currency. And I 100% believe that. So I want you to know I appreciate what you spend here. And with that, as you leave here and go out into your lives, whatever it may be, I just want to wish you all the best in the world. It's old tradition here on TCR. I like to close with a little moment of positivity if I can. So, keep getting out of bed in the morning, keep putting those shoes on, and whatever happens, I want you to know I'm rooting for you. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next week.